Rival protests turn deadly in Kirkuk. The violence follows months of tension between Kurdish, Arab, and Turkmen residents, adding to Iraq's political troubles. How can peace be returned to one of the country's most ethnically diverse cities? Also on the program, 22 years after the September 11th attacks, we'll ask a U.S. soldier to reflect on the response. And did the war in Iraq make the country and the world a safer place? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Iraq. Iraq's northern city of Kirkuk has once again become a flashpoint of ethnic tension after a controversial decision by Prime Minister Mohammed al-Sudani to hand over a building to the KDP. On Sunday, Kurdish demonstrators confronted Arab and Turkmen groups blockading a highway to Erbil to protest that decision. 4 people were shot dead, with human rights groups accusing Iraqi security forces of opening fire without warning. The violence has left many wondering if Baghdad can bridge divisions in the oil-rich Kirkuk region. Here's a look.
Months of tensions have turned into deadly protests in Iraq's Kirkuk city. Last month, Prime Minister Mohammed al-Sudani ordered the handover of the federal police headquarters to the KDP, one of northern Iraq's largest parties. Turkmen and Arab demonstrators blocked Kirkuk-Erbil highway to oppose the move, with supporters of the Kurdish Democratic Party staging rival protests. Despite the presence of the security forces, 4 people were shot dead and 15 others injured. Prime Minister al-Sudani imposed a curfew and ordered an inquiry into the violence. The Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan also voiced concern over the unrest in a region that is an ancestral Turkmen homeland.
Kirkuk is an ancient city that has recently experienced great suffering and massacres. We consider that delicate social balances in this city should be protected, and all social segments should be given equal say in representation and administration.
Human Rights Watch has called on the central government to investigate allegations of excessive use of deadly force by security personnel.
Time and again, the Iraqi government has responded to protests with lethal force and arrests of journalists. The government needs to take concrete steps that result in accountability for these actions.
Kurdish forces controlled Kirkuk after defeating Daesh in 2014. In 2017, the Kurdish regional government held a controversial independence referendum. The vote led to a military conflict between federal and regional forces. Iraqi government forces entered the city and captured key government buildings. The army used vacated KDP buildings as their headquarters, and it's these facilities that are at the center of the current tensions. The central government's plan to return the building to the KDP met with strong opposition from ethnic Turkmens, who have called for dialogue.
All parties should sit at the round table and make joint decisions regarding the present and future of the city.
Following the violence, Iraq's Supreme Court suspended the building's handover, and the Iraqi government says it will form a leadership committee to visit Kirkuk and address the oil-rich region's escalating tensions.
Well, joining me now to discuss the future of Kirkuk are from Ankara, Murat Aslan. He's an associate professor in security studies at Hasan Kalyoncu University. And from Istanbul is Tarık Oğuzlu, a professor of political science and international relations at Istanbul Aydin University. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, this is an incredibly complex situation. It has a lot of history behind it. But Murat, let's talk about why these tensions are culminating now. I mean, handing over this building was agreed some time ago, but doing it seems to symbolize something much more insidious to the city's Turkmen and Arab populations. Explain why.
Well, Kirkuk is the heart of Iraq, and if you just have the overall picture of Iraq, you can easily witness what's going on over there just by observing the dynamics in Kirkuk, because it does have a meaning for Kurds that it's a heritage for them. For Turkomans, well, they are settled over there for more than 1,000 years. They were brought from Central Asia by Abbasids, by the way. And Arabs, well, they see Kirkuk as, a location that it's their home. In this sense, all parties over there perceive Kirkuk that they should keep it under control. And that's the primary reason of current escalations over there.
Ultimately, do you think the KDP authorities want to take Kirkuk fully under their administration? Is that what the Turkmen and Arab populations there fear?
Well, there's a history. You can go back to the 1960s, 70s, but I think we should focus on the latest decade, especially 2010s and afters, because right after Daesh, erupted in Iraq, there were, a crisis, especially in Kirkuk, because Kirkuk was handed over to Kurds first, Peshmerga, then Hashdi Shabi recaptured it. And there was a disagreement between the Kurdish groups, say KDP and PUK. And now there's a great political bargaining just to keep the position of Prime Ministry, Sudani, maybe having Kirkuk as a chip. In this sense, the one who press a lot to have the current coalition be valid on Iraq, well, they want to have the Kirkuk, and that's the essential question.
Tarık Oğuzlu, I'm wondering if you agree on the analysis of the history there. If you would like to comment on that, go ahead. But I'd also like you to talk a little bit about how the tension now is being addressed, and the government wants to form a leadership committee. Is that the answer to... Go ahead.
As we have already known, the current struggles that have taken place in recent decades can be dated back to the 2003 U.S. occupation of Iraq. After this event, the status of Kirkuk region has become more and more important because we know that the Kurdish regional government lays claim to this particular city, thinking that if they have full control of Kirkuk, the possibility of KRG becoming a kind of independent state in the years to come would go up. So Turkey, central government in Baghdad, and Iranian government as well are quite opposing to this particular specter. So from a larger regional perspective, the countries in the region are very much against this idea, the idea that Kirkuk become a part of KRG. But from an intra-Iraqi political perspective, we also know that these three different ethnic groups are in a competition with each other in terms of having the final say in the administration of the city. So we also know that Turkmen communities and Arabic communities are very sensitive on this idea because in their eyes, Kirkuk should remain as part of central Iraqi administration rather than being given to KRG region. But Kurdish people, on the other hand, think that this is their Jerusalem, so Kirkuk is their Jerusalem. There is no way for them to agree to this idea that Kirkuk should remain outside the territorial boundaries of so-called KRG region.
And some of those beliefs are quite steadfast. But Tarık, I'll stick with you. Again, the government is now saying that the next step will be to form this leadership committee, and they will go to Kirkuk and better look at the situation. How hopeful are you that that is a necessary step to begin resolving this tension and keep the status of Kirkuk as part of Greater Iraq?
I am actually a little bit hopeful because both Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan and other high-level people in regional countries, Iranian Foreign Minister in particular, have expressed their dissatisfaction with the latest developments on the ground. So there is a kind of pressure put on the central government in Baghdad coming from regional countries. And there is also a pressure coming from Turkmen community and also Arabic community in the region on the central government. So I don't think that the Iraqi politics, I mean the dynamics of Iraqi politics and the dynamics of Iraqi-Iranian relationship, as well as the dynamics of Iraqi-Turkish relationship will pave the way for KRG to take full control of the city. So over the last 6 years, since 2017, Kirkuk region has been administered by central government in Baghdad. So I think if they find a face-saving solution to make sure that this situation continues, that would highly likely satisfy the concerns of the parties, even including the Kurdish government in KRG region, because KRG is in dire need of having good and cooperative relationship with Turkey. And also we know that Iranian administration has been putting so much pressure on the government in Baghdad, and Iran is very against this idea, Turkey becoming a part of KRG.
Okay, Murat, I mean, I'm wondering if you see the same way forward as Tarık was talking about there. And if you could also draw in, because you've commented before on the role that the Marxist-Leninist PKK might be playing in this, and has its presence actually further divided Iraqi Kurds and caused more tension overall in Kirkuk as well.
Actually, I'm on the same page with Professor Tarık regarding the influence of Iran, because Iran is really the primary actor in Iraq right now. Whatever they impose, well, it becomes. The second thing, and it's relevant to PKK presence in Kirkuk, there was a meeting of Prime Minister Sudani together with Bafel Talabani in Süleymaniye discussing how to build a coalition, state administration coalition. It was 2017-18, something like that. And what happened, they agreed on building this coalition against Sadr movement. On the other hand, they agreed on some certain chips. For instance, Kirkuk was one condition. And if you take Talabani, Bafel Talabani to the table, well, you must understand that Iran is in the picture. PKK is actually in the picture because Talabani is trying to balance KDP by the hands of PKK. Just remember the helicopter crashed in Iraq. They were carrying PKK terrorists from Syria to Süleymaniye, and it was a Talabani helicopter funded by the United States Army. On the other hand, Talabani is in close cooperation with Iran. So Kirkuk is somehow a picture of this, complicated relations. Iran plays for authority and autonomy in Iraq by the hands of the prime minister, playing for the Shia community. On the other hand, PKK is totally, consistent with the policies of Iran in Iraq and Talabani. And if something happens in Kirkuk, well, the competition of KDP and PUK, Talabani, well, it brings PKK to the agenda.
Okay. Very quickly, Murat, because, the United States has said that part of the solution here, I'm coming to you again because you commented specifically on this. The United States has now said to use Article 140 as guidance, but you've noted that article is actually in dispute and maybe should not be applied. So why? And if it can't be applied, is there a legitimate law to follow here?
Well, I have an academic article on the Constitution of Iraq and Afghanistan. I compared both. My conclusion was that both constitutions are actually imposed by the United States, either on Afghanistan or Iraq. And 140 is actually a favoring article to Kurds because Article 140, it requires a certain progress in terms of identifying the status of Kirkuk. It was 3-step. The first one required normalization because the demography had changed, either by the hands of Saddam or Kurds. And the second thing, census to pinpoint exactly the status of the ethnicities in the region, and then a referendum. Today, the demography of Kirkuk has changed. For instance, there are some allegations that 1 million Kurds, either from Iran, Syria, or the other parts of Iraq, they are brought to Kirkuk by Kurdish regional government. In this sense, the applicability of this article is impossible. But there's a federal court decision that it can be applied, but I don't know, and I'm not sure if public in Kirkuk will accept it, mainly of Arab and Turkoman origin.
Okay. Tarık, do you think there's a fundamental problem here with the role that this constitution is playing that many people dispute?
it is 100% sure that the way how the Constitution was written back in 2005 and how it was supposed to be played out in the region might have caused the current tension we are experiencing nowadays. Because I am of the view that there is no way for the parties, all considered parties, to come a face-saving solution in terms of how to make sure that this Article 140 would be applied in the region. And the Turkish community, the Turkmen community, the Arabic community will never feel satisfied regarding the terms of how this constitution will be applied and how a kind of referendum will be, how a kind of census, first of all, and then later on a plebiscite, for example, will be applied in the region. Because from their own perspective, if such kind of a situation took place, it might be somehow possible that more than half of the people, living in the Kirkuk region might say yes for incorporation of Kirkuk in the KRG region. So I think it is not that much easy for this Turkmen and Arabic communities to agree on this idea. The idea that this dispute might be resolved through legal procedures. It is very much a political dispute and it requires a political compromise. But given this situation, it is not that much easy.
Tarık Oğuzlu and Murat Aslan, those will have to be the final words. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on this segment of the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated. Now, it's been 22 years since the world watched in utter shock as two commercial jetliners crashed into New York's Twin Towers. Even greater horror set in when both 110-story buildings fell to the ground, killing some 3,000 people. The anniversary has been marked across attack sites at the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. President Joe Biden spoke at a military base in Anchorage, Alaska, using the occasion to call for unity.
The soul of America is the fortitude we found in the fear of that terrible September day, the purpose we found in our pain, the light we found in our darkest hour, an hour when terrorists believed they could bring us to our knees, bend our will, break our resolve. But they were wrong. They were dead wrong. In the crucible of 9/11 and the days and months that followed, we saw the stuff America's made of.
But the military response to the 9/11 attacks would challenge that fortitude and purpose, both at home and abroad. With extensive international support, Afghanistan was invaded to take down the Taliban and the al-Qaeda terrorists hiding there. But a year and a half later, in a move that broke with international law and consensus, the U.S. invaded Iraq. Just 6 weeks after U.S. troops entered the country and overthrew its leader, Saddam Hussein, U.S. President George W. Bush would announce mission accomplished. But Iraq's weapons of mass destruction that formed the premise for the war were never found, and U.S. troops would ultimately spend upwards of a decade in the country. But instead of delivering the promised democracy, the invasion set Iraq on a path toward devastating security, political, and economic crises. So 22 years after the September 11th attacks, how do U.S. soldiers view the response and the war in Iraq? Well, joining me now is one of those soldiers. Jesse Damsky was deployed to Iraq in 2004 with the U.S. Army, and he joins us now to talk about his experience and perspective on that war today. Jesse, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Andrea.
Well,
Great to be here.
Let's begin with when you were first deployed. You had graduated from Georgia Southern University. You studied Arabic there. You spoke the language, which made you one of the very few in the U.S. Armed Services who could speak Arabic, and off you went to Iraq. How did you feel about your deployment at that time? Were you on board with the U.S. being under threat from Saddam Hussein post-September 11th?
On one hand, as a young soldier, I was excited about the prospect of being part of this operation. And that was what I was trained for the better part of the last couple of years of my life. However, the reality of the war came very quick. My first son was born a month into the deployment, and I didn't really see him for a year. So, the excitement really faded, which I think is quite often the case with war for soldiers. With regards to the threat from Saddam Hussein, I think I was an early doubter in that regard. I had studied Arabic, as you mentioned, and I had already been to the Middle East. I am an avid follower to today of the news and what's going on. And we just watched the justifications changing as the administration was throwing things out there and seeing what stuck. At first it was terrorism, then it was WMD, democracy. And I think as that really dragged on, the soldiers ourselves weren't really clear why we were there. And I think is a little bit a mix of an ideology about transforming the Middle East, and that kind of got taken along with some of the think tanks and the contractors. So I don't think Saddam Hussein was a real threat to the United States, and I think in retrospect we can say the entire narrative behind the war was dubious at best.
Dubious at best. Was there a point when you were actually just convinced that something was wrong with U.S. policy in Iraq? You mentioned some of the contractors, what you saw going on there. And then what did you see it all doing to Iraqi society?
From my own standpoint, I could safely say that it was immediately apparent that something was wrong. My unit drove from Kuwait to Baghdad without doors on the Humvee. So the main threat at that time was roadside bombs. And there I am driving 600 kilometers without any protection or doors. So that indicated to me that something was really wrong in the planning. And it appeared that the administration was more, they prioritized the optics of not having too many soldiers and reducing casualties to an acceptable level. And I think, a lot of these decisions that were directing the war were really taken through the lens of domestic policy. And I think that is very dangerous. But if we look at the Iraqi side, I think it was also quite apparent early on that the Iraqis didn't want us there. We weren't greeted as liberators, and our presence really inflamed some deep ethnic and religious differences in the countries. Some of the terrorist groups that came to Iraq, ironically after the invasion, exploited that. And I think the local population really paid the brunt of that. And some really, really disturbing things happened in that period to otherwise innocent people. I don't think the administration understood the culture, the language, or the history, or the religion, and they were blinded by their own political ideology and perhaps profits. The result was a fracturing of the society, which is still trying to define its national identity to today.
As far as the damage to Iraqi society then is concerned, you saw specific damage done to children that you actually ended up working with and spending time with and bringing some to the United States. Talk a little bit about why you felt you had to do that. What motivated you?
Yes, that is correct. So after my participation in the war, I worked with a humanitarian group to bring some Iraqi children for medical treatment to the United States and to other Middle Eastern countries. That was actually, it started off as somebody I knew during the war whose daughter needed that help. So I really felt compelled to do that. But once I started, then I continued on with different families. And I think, when you look at a war like the Iraq War, it was really the innocent civilians and the children that paid the brunt of it. And I think what surprised me most was the resilience of the kids. Some of the horrific things that they went through, and were still able to have a smile and be positive about the future. I think that was really impactful for me, and I had a lot of sympathy for those victims, and I wanted to do my part in some small measure to make amends for the catastrophe that was unleashed upon the country.
So Jesse, when you see what's happening in Kirkuk today that we just spoke about, are you surprised?
I'm not surprised. I would say saddened. I think as a result of the invasion, and to some extent, we can also include in that the previous regime, Iraq has really been struggling to define itself for all Iraqis. Iraq is not a monolith. It's a very complex mosaic of different religious groups and ethnicities. And the wave of violence that the invasion caused fractured society and sowed the seeds of mistrust. The challenge now for the Iraqi government is going to be to prevent the balkanization of the country and restoring trust in an inclusive national identity. I think maybe the recent events in Kirkuk are a manifestation of that distrust.
Jesse, ultimately, though, and I mean, you know Iraq and Iraqis pretty well. You speak their language. You spent that time there. You have many Iraqi friends, as far as I know. Do you still have hope for Iraq, knowing them? Do you still think that there can be a sense of unity and it can be pulled together?
Yes, of course. I think anybody who knows the Iraqi people knows that, number one, Iraq is an amazingly rich country. It has a very long history going back to early Mesopotamia, and the Iraqi people are a proud and resilient people. So I do believe they'll get through these times, but it's really going to be a challenge for the government to bring all of these different ethnicities together under one, one nation. I think the invasion really damaged that national unity, and we have to admit that. So I think it's also something that the Iraqis themselves need to work out. Foreign intervention will only irritate that process. But I strongly believe that Iraq will come out of this eventually, and I believe that the Iraqi people will be united for a better future.
Okay. Jesse Damsky, we will have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Great to have you, and thank our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.